When World War II ended in August 1945, the battleship did not disappear overnight. Instead, it became something far more dangerous to its own survival, a logistical burden. For the first time in naval history, the world's largest navies possessed more battleships than they could afford, justify, or crew. The United States Navy stood at the center of this problem. At war's end, it controlled 23 battleships, the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled by a single nation. Some were modern fast battleships built only months earlier. Others were veterans of 2 world wars. All were expensive, all required massive crews, and most no longer fit the strategic future-taking shape. Demobilization began immediately. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, the Navy began releasing hundreds of thousands of sailors back into civilian life. Battleships were manpower-intensive platforms, requiring between 1,500 and 2,700 crew members each. As personnel numbers collapsed, ships that could not operate with skeleton crews were the first to be removed from service. By late 1945, battleships were divided into 3 categories: ships to remain active temporarily, ships to be placed in reserve, ships to be permanently disposed of. The oldest vessels were the first marked for removal. Battleships built during or shortly after World War I were judged unsuitable for modern naval warfare. Their maximum speeds were too low to escort aircraft carriers. Their anti-aircraft defenses were outdated. Their internal layouts made modernization costly and inefficient. Keeping them active made no economic or military sense. As a result, these ships were rapidly decommissioned. Decommissioning was not symbolic. It was mechanical. Ammunition was removed. Fire control systems were dismantled. Engines were shut down. Crews were reassigned or discharged. Flags were lowered. The ships remained afloat, but they were no longer warships. Some of these battleships were immediately sold for scrap. Scrapping a battleship was a slow, industrial process. Armor plating was cut apart with torches. Turrets were dismantled piece by piece. Engines, wiring, and fittings were removed and sold. The steel was melted down and reused in civilian construction and manufacturing. In the austere post-war economy, the metal alone was valuable. Other battleships were not scrapped because the Navy had another use for them. In 1946, the United States prepared for Operation Crossroads, a series of atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Naval planners wanted to understand how nuclear weapons would affect fleets at sea. Old battleships were selected as test targets. These ships were already obsolete. Their sacrifice would provide data no simulation could replace. They were towed to the Pacific, anchored alongside cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, and deliberately left unmanned. When the atomic bombs detonated, battleships that had survived decades of conventional warfare were subjected to forces far beyond anything imagined during their design. Some sank almost immediately. Others survived the blasts but were rendered unusable by structural damage and radioactive contamination. Those that remained afloat were later scuttled or sunk during weapons testing. They did not return. Meanwhile, newer battleships faced a different decision. The fast battleships built late in the war, especially those capable of keeping pace with aircraft carriers, were considered too valuable to destroy outright. These ships represented enormous investments of time, material, and money. Scrapping them so soon after completion was politically and strategically difficult. Instead, they were placed into the reserve fleet. Reserve fleets were carefully organized storage systems, not graveyards. Battleships were anchored in protected harbors. Their internal spaces were sealed. Machinery was preserved with protective compounds. Dehumidifiers were installed to prevent corrosion. Small maintenance crews inspected them regularly. On paper, these ships could be returned to service if war broke out again. In reality, each year in reserve reduced that likelihood. As 1946 and 1947 passed, defense budgets shrank dramatically. The U.S. Congress prioritized nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, and aircraft carriers. The Navy was forced to accept a new reality. It could not keep everything. Battleships continued to leave service. By the end of 1947, the majority of America's pre-war and early war battleships were gone, scrapped, sunk, or permanently decommissioned. Only a small number of the most modern ships remained in reserve or limited service. This same pattern unfolded worldwide. Britain, financially exhausted, scrapped most of its battleships within a few years. France retained a handful briefly, then followed the same path. Italy's remaining battleships were divided among the Allies or dismantled. Japan's were already destroyed or captured. The battleship had not been defeated in battle. It had been defeated by economics, air power, and the atomic age. Yet despite everything, scrapping, nuclear destruction, and mass decommissioning, battleships were not finished. Within just a few years, global events would force navies to reconsider ships they believed were obsolete, and some of those silent giants would sail again. By 1946, the fate of many battleships had already been sealed, but not all endings were quiet or routine. Some of the most famous warships ever built were about to be destroyed deliberately, not because they were useless, but because they were needed for something new. Nuclear weapons had entered warfare, and the world's navies needed proof of what that meant. The United States chose its oldest and most expendable battleships for the task. Operation Crossroads was planned as a controlled experiment, but it was also an execution. More than 90 ships were assembled at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, including battleships, cruisers, carriers, submarines, and support vessels. Among them were American battleships that had fought in both world wars. These ships were not stripped or dismantled. They were prepared, anchored, and left intact so scientists could observe how atomic weapons affected full-scale warships. On July 1, 1946, the first bomb detonated above the fleet. The explosion did not instantly destroy every battleship. Several remained afloat, battered but still recognizable. This surprised many observers. Battleships, with their thick armor and compartmentalized construction, proved far more resistant to blast effects than expected. That durability did not save them. The second test, conducted weeks later, detonated an atomic bomb underwater. The result was catastrophic. A massive column of water engulfed the target fleet, slamming ships with pressure far beyond their design limits. One battleship capsized and sank almost immediately. Others were flooded, twisted, or poisoned by radioactive contamination. Survival became irrelevant. Battleships that remained afloat were too radioactive to repair. Crews could not safely reboard them. Even ships that looked structurally intact were permanently compromised. Over the following months, they were either scuttled at sea or used as gunnery targets until they sank. Their final role was scientific. Operation Crossroads marked a turning point. It demonstrated that while battleships might survive blast effects, they were extremely vulnerable to radiation, contamination, and operational denial. A ship that could not be crewed was effectively dead, no matter how much armor it carried. For many navies, this settled the debate. Across the late 1940s, battleships disappeared at an accelerating pace. Those not destroyed in tests were sold to scrapyards in unprecedented numbers. Britain dismantled most of its remaining capital ships. France followed suit. The Soviet Union scrapped or repurposed captured hulls. Italy's surviving battleships were divided among the Allies or broken apart. Scrapping was not a symbolic gesture. It was a strategic decision. Battleships consumed enormous resources even when inactive. Dock space, maintenance crews, corrosion control, and inspections all cost money. In a world rebuilding from war, governments prioritized housing, industry, and new military technologies. Keeping old battleships made no financial sense. Scrapyards worked for years dismantling these ships. Armor plate that had once deflected shells was cut apart with industrial torches. Turrets weighing thousands of tons were broken down piece by piece. Engines, wiring, and fittings were removed and sold. By the early 1950s, dozens of famous battleships existed only as recycled steel. Yet not all battleships met the same fate. Some ships were not scrapped or destroyed because they were still considered potentially useful. The most modern American battleships, especially those capable of high speed, were placed into reserve fleets instead of scrapyards. Reserve did not mean abandonment. These ships were preserved with extreme care. Internal spaces were sealed. Machinery was coated in protective grease. Moisture was controlled. Hulls were inspected regularly. The Navy intended to keep them in a condition that allowed reactivation within months if needed. At the time, this seemed prudent. The Cold War was beginning. Global tensions were rising. No one could predict where the next conflict would erupt. Having battleships available as contingency appeared sensible, even if their role was unclear. But the reserve fleets also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Every year battleships sat idle. It became harder to bring back. Technology moved on. Spare parts became scarce. Crew training pipelines disappeared. New weapon systems made old designs increasingly incompatible with modern combat. Many reserve battleships would never sail again. By the late 1940s, the pattern was clear. Battleships followed one of four paths after World War II. Immediate scrapping, destruction during nuclear testing, long-term reserve with declining prospects, preservation through exceptional circumstances. Most followed the first two. Only a small number avoided final disposal, and fewer still would return to combat. The battleship, once the centerpiece of naval power, had become a specialized tool, kept only when nothing else could do the job as effectively. The world had not stopped needing firepower. It had simply found other ways to deliver it. Yet global events were about to challenge that assumption. Within a few years, war would return to the Asian continent, and navies would once again reach into their reserve fleets for weapons they believed were obsolete. For some battleships, destruction had been delayed, not avoided. They were about to sail again. The return of the battleship was not planned. It was forced by war. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, and within weeks United Nations troops were retreating toward the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. Air power alone could not stop the advance. Ground forces needed heavy, sustained fire support along coastlines and supply routes that were often unreachable by artillery. The United States Navy searched for a solution already floating in reserve. Battleships, dismissed only years earlier as obsolete, possessed one capability nothing else could replace: massive, accurate, long-range gunfire that could be delivered continuously in all weather, day or night. Within months, reserve ships were reactivated. Recommissioning a battleship was not simple, but it was faster than building anything new. Crews were assembled from across the fleet. Old systems were inspected, repaired, and tested. Guns that had not fired in years were recalibrated. Within weeks, battleships that had been sitting idle were steaming toward combat zones. Once deployed, their impact was immediate. Battleships off the Korean coast delivered firepower unmatched by any other naval platform. A single broadside could collapse bunkers, destroy supply depots, and shatter troop concentrations miles inland. Their shells, each weighing nearly a ton, could penetrate hardened positions that aircraft bombs sometimes failed to neutralize. Equally important, battleships could stay on station. Unlike aircraft, they did not require air superiority. Unlike artillery, they were not limited by terrain. They could fire thousands of rounds over weeks without needing to withdraw. For commanders under pressure, they became floating artillery bases. The battleship's effectiveness surprised many. Their presence stabilized fronts, supported amphibious landings, and provided psychological impact as well as physical destruction. Enemy forces learned to recognize the sound of incoming heavy shells and abandoned exposed positions. But Korea also exposed battleship limitations. They were vulnerable to mines. Their anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate against jets. They required large crews, complex logistics, and extensive maintenance. While effective, they were expensive and increasingly difficult to justify in a rapidly modernizing military. When the armistice was signed in 1953, battleships were again placed in question. This time, the decision leaned heavily toward retirement. The post-Korean War period saw rapid technological change. Guided missiles began replacing guns. Submarines grew quieter and more lethal. Aircraft gained precision capabilities that rivaled naval gunfire. Strategic thinking shifted toward flexibility, speed, and long-range strike rather than armored endurance. Battleships returned to reserve fleets in large numbers. Some were decommissioned immediately. Others remained technically available but increasingly neglected. Systems aged. Corrosion advanced. Spare parts vanished. The knowledge required to operate massive steam plants and complex fire control systems became rare. By the early 1960s, most battleships were effectively dead assets. Yet history repeated itself. In the late 1960s, the United States again faced a land war requiring heavy coastal firepower. In Vietnam, enemy positions were often dug into hills, jungles, and hardened bunkers beyond the reach of conventional artillery. Once again, the Navy turned to a battleship. A single ship was reactivated, modernized, and deployed. Its guns delivered devastating fire along the coast, destroying infrastructure, and providing close support to ground forces. The ship's performance proved that battleship gunfire was still tactically valuable. but it also highlighted how narrow that value had become. The deployment was short. Costs were high. Maintenance demands were extreme. Once the mission ended, the ship returned to reserve status and was never recommissioned again during that war. For most naval planners, this confirmed the conclusion already forming. Battleships were no longer central weapons of war. They were situational tools, useful only when specific conditions aligned. By the 1970s, even reserve status became difficult to justify. The ships were old. Their systems were incompatible with modern fleet operations. Their armor no longer protected against missiles. Their guns, though powerful, lacked the precision and flexibility of aircraft and guided weapons. Many battleships were finally struck from naval registers and sold for scrap. Yet the story did not end there. During the Cold War's later decades, geopolitical tensions once again shifted naval priorities. The rise of long-range cruise missiles offered an unexpected opportunity. Battleships possessed massive decks, deep magazines, and exceptional survivability. With sufficient modification, they could carry modern weapons while retaining their original firepower. The idea seemed improbable, but it gained traction. Modernization programs were proposed that replaced outdated systems with missile launchers, electronic warfare equipment, and advanced targeting systems. The battleship would not compete with carriers. It would complement them as a heavily armed strike platform. Against expectations, the plan moved forward. Battleships were pulled from reserve, modernized, and returned to service decades after they were first built. Their decks now housed missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of miles inland. Their guns remained, upgraded and integrated with modern fire control systems. They had evolved. For a brief period, battleships once again became active warships, participating in patrols, deterrence missions, and regional conflicts. Their presence carried enormous symbolic weight, representing both military power and historical continuity. But time was relentless. Despite modernization, battleships remained manpower-intensive, expensive, and inflexible compared to newer platforms. Missiles could be launched from smaller ships. Aircraft could strike faster and farther. Submarines offered stealth battleships could never achieve. By the early 1990s, the final chapter began. Budget pressures, changing threats, and shifting strategy made continued operation unsustainable. Battleships were decommissioned one last time, not into reserve, but into history. Some would be preserved. Most would not. Their final fate would reveal how nations chose to remember, or forget, the weapons that once ruled the seas. The end of the battleship era was both inevitable and symbolic. By the 1990s, advances in naval technology had made even the most modernized battleships redundant. Aircraft carriers dominated the seas. Guided missiles could strike with precision at ranges battleships could only dream of, and submarines could threaten fleets undetected. Even the Iowa-class vessels, the last true American battleships, could no longer justify their immense operating costs, manpower requirements, and logistical burden. Yet, these ships were not destined for immediate scrapping. The Navy faced a unique dilemma: how to retire vessels that were iconic, historically significant, and still operationally capable in certain scenarios. For decades, battleships had embodied American naval power, projecting strength during two world wars, Korea, Vietnam, and even the Cold War. They were symbols of national pride as much as they were tools of war. A few Iowa-class ships would be preserved, forever frozen in time as museum ships. USS Missouri, the vessel that had witnessed Japan's surrender in 1945, returned to Pearl Harbor and was permanently berthed alongside the USS Arizona Memorial, a powerful connection between the beginning and end of America's Pacific War. USS New Jersey found a home in Camden, New Jersey, allowing visitors to experience firsthand the scale and firepower of a battleship. USS Wisconsin was preserved in Norfolk, Virginia, and USS Iowa became a museum in Los Angeles, California. These vessels offered more than nostalgia. They were educational tools. Visitors could walk their teak decks, explore turret interiors, and examine fire control rooms, gaining insight into the immense logistical and technical challenges of operating a capital ship. They preserve a tactile history of naval warfare that no book or photograph could fully capture. They stood as reminders of a bygone era when armored guns, rather than missiles, determined naval dominance. But the majority of battleships were not so fortunate. Most were scrapped, dismantled piece by piece, or deliberately sunk as targets. Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll in 1946 had already demonstrated how the Navy used aging vessels for nuclear tests, providing invaluable data on atomic weapons effects on capital ships. USS Arkansas, USS Nevada, and USS New York became radioactive test subjects. Arkansas sank immediately after the underwater Baker test, while Nevada survived but was too contaminated to return to service and was eventually sunk as a target. These experiments, harsh as they were, advanced naval science and marked the first chapter of battleships' post-war decline. In the following decades, budget cuts and technological obsolescence dictated the fate of other ships. Older fast battleships of the North Carolina and South Dakota classes were decommissioned and moved into reserve fleets. Many were later scrapped in the 1960s. USS Alabama, USS Massachusetts, and USS North Carolina were preserved, but their preservation required significant public support, fundraising, and civic engagement, an extraordinary effort reflecting both historical consciousness and regional pride. Even the Iowa-class battleships faced intermittent service before final retirement. USS New Jersey was recommissioned in 1968 for the Vietnam War, providing fire support along the Vietnamese coast. Between 1968 and 1969, her 16-inch guns demolished enemy bunkers and artillery positions, proving that battleship firepower retained situational relevance even in the missile age. In the 1980s, under President Reagan's naval expansion program, all 4 Iowas were modernized with Tomahawk cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, close-in defense systems, and updated electronics. They patrolled global hotspots, fired missiles during the Persian Gulf War, and demonstrated that, even after nearly 50 years, these ships could be combat effective. Yet the modernization was temporary. By the 1990s, the costs of maintaining, staffing, and modernizing battleships exceeded any tactical advantage they offered. Aircraft and missile systems could achieve the same objectives more efficiently and safely. USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin were decommissioned for the final time between 1990 and 1992. Although congressional language initially required that at least 2 battleships remain available for reactivation, technological evolution rendered this obsolete, and by 2006, the last formal requirement was lifted. The story of American battleships after World War II is a story of adaptation, resilience, and eventual obsolescence. They were resurrected for Korea and Vietnam, modernized for Cold War deterrence, and still fired missiles in combat as late as the Persian Gulf War. Yet, in every era, their continued relevance was challenged by new technology, cost, and strategy. They proved capable, flexible, and formidable, but they could not compete with the speed, range, and efficiency of modern warfare. In total, of the 23 American battleships that survived World War II, 7 remain preserved as museum ships, offering a tangible link to the past. The other 16 were scrapped or sunk, providing material for research, weapons testing, or peacetime industry. This dichotomy illustrates the Navy's post-war reality, a desire to honor history while embracing a future defined by aircraft carriers, submarines, and missiles. Battleships were once the ultimate expression of naval might, but their era had ended. Walking along the decks of these preserved ships today, visitors witness the intersection of history, technology, and human effort. Every turret, engine room, and ammunition magazine tells a story of global conflict, logistical mastery, and the evolution of naval warfare. The battleship survival in museums ensures that, although their guns will never fire again, their legacy remains alive. They are reminders that technological supremacy is never permanent, that innovation redefines strategy, and that even the mightiest machines eventually yield to time. In the end, the story of battleships after World War II is not just about steel and firepower. It is about adaptation, obsolescence, and preservation. They survived wars, nuclear tests, technological revolutions, and political debates. Some now educate future generations, while others rest beneath the waves. Their fate reflects the broader arc of naval history, victory, utility, and eventual retirement in the face of progress. The battleships that once ruled the oceans now rule memory, standing as enduring symbols of American naval heritage.